look forward to the talk.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about is a series of studies that I've sort of been collecting over the years. Since graduate school, I've been puzzled by why it is that men and women have such different experiences when they. I'm going to talk about a series of studies that I've sort of been. Okay, yeah, that's me. Graduate school.
We're getting a feedback there.
Yes. Okay, that was it. That's next.
Okay, should I do it with the mic or not?
With the mic is fine now.
I think the issue is with the computer. Okay. We're going to try again. Okay. Okay, let's try again. I was born and raised in Denmark, and growing up in the 70s in Denmark, I don't know if you've seen pictures, but whether or not you were a boy or a girl, you pretty much wore the exact same clothing. So that was the world I came from, and then I came to the US for graduate school, and it pretty quickly became clear that there are larger differences between males and females in the US than what I was used to. Then I sort of started looking, well, what are the differences? Indeed, you look across countries, there are lots of differences in labor force participation. The wage gap really varies across all these different countries. The one thing that is quite systematic when we look at countries is that women really struggle to sort of break through the glass ceiling. So the advancement of women is much lower than it is for men, and that is not something that varies by country. So whether or not you're in the US or in Denmark, women are underrepresented on boards, and they're really underrepresented when we sort of reach the upper levels in organizations. Another thing that is quite systematic across countries is that women are underrepresented if you look at the sort of top part of the wage distribution. So 34% of women have earnings above the median of men, which obviously 50% of men are there. If you look at the very top 20% of men's earnings, you only have 10% of women there. So there's just sort of lots of differences across countries. What is fairly systematic is that we struggle to sort of get to the very top in corporations. So that's what my work is focused on, trying to understand what is it that makes it harder for women to sort of climb this corporate ladder. And I would say over the past 10 years, my co-authors and I have sort of been narrowing in to start thinking about what it is that's causing this, and the extent to which one of the sort of key factors could be the task assignments that we're giving men and women differing. In particular, what we've found fairly systematically is that if you think about tasks that we are assigned at work, varying in promotability, that is the extent to which your performance on those tasks is going to be noticed and help you advance. What we're seeing quite clearly is that women end up getting more of the tasks that are low in promotability, and men get more of the tasks that are high in promotability. And you could say, well, how do we know what is promotable? Well, in academia, it's pretty clear, right? So, but just to make sure that we agree what is promotable in academia, we did a quick survey of faculty members, and we said, okay, let's imagine that there's a faculty member who is an assistant professor. We're trying to figure out how they best should spend 50 hours over the next semester. How should they best do that to get promoted? Should they work on a research paper, present a research talk, serve on an undergraduate curriculum committee, or on faculty senate? These are all important things that we do. Like, they're super important for our jobs, but I'm sure none of you will be surprised to know that 92%, I don't know who the 8% were, but 92% of faculty agree that working on research is what is going to get you promoted. If we look at industry, the same result is going to come out. If you work on revenue generating tasks, you're going to be more likely to get promoted than if you work on non-revenue generating tasks. So the promotability is going to, the kind of task that you get is going to affect whether or not you advance. And indeed, just as an example, my co-author Linda Babcock worked with this professional service firm where they, following sort of the work that we had done, categorized tasks within the service firm and whether or not they were promotable and non-promotable tasks. And then this is one of these firms where you keep close account for billing in terms of what it is that people are doing. And that data showed that for the women, they were spending about 200 more hours per year on non-promotable work, and men were spending a lot more work, they had more hours on promotable work. So we're seeing these differences in the tasks that are being assigned. If we go to look at the literature, why not you look at academia or in industry, we're seeing that women end up with more tasks that don't help them advance. Now, the question, of course, is why should we be concerned about this? It doesn't sound so great for the women, but why should the rest of society be concerned about this? Sounds like the men have a pretty good deal. One of the reasons why we should be concerned is that in order to make society the best society it could be, we should have the right people get promoted. And if we end up from the very beginning, when women and men enter the labor market, assigning women more to the tasks that don't help demonstrate the critical skills, then we're not going to promote the right people. So this gender task allocation comes at the cost that it's going to be much harder to identify the underlying talent. So if we sort of think about, okay, if that's a problem, well, whether or not it's a problem really depends on why we're seeing differences in task allocations to begin with. You know, for sure, is less of a problem if women just prefer the non-promotable work. We can't as a society say you might prefer that, but we really don't want you to prefer those tasks. It could be that there are differences in ability, that they really are not as good at the promotable work, that they should be spending more time on non-promotable work from a societal perspective. That should not be concerning to us. Where I've sort of focused my work is on seeing whether or not there might be behavioral differences in the way that we respond to the allocation of these tasks. So just to sort of make it more concrete, as I said before, if we think about these highly promotable tasks and less promotable tasks, some of my early work, I looked at gender differences in competition, where I showed conditional in performance that men are more likely to enjoy the competition, enter the competition, where part of the reason is that they're more overconfident. That could explain why it is that they end up with the more promotable work. But what I'm going to talk about today is more whether or not the sort of less promotable, the non-promotable work is just a residual of that. Or is there something about the way that we allocate non-promotable work that makes women be more likely to end up there? So this, as I said before, is joined with Linda Babcock at Carnegie Mellon, Maria Ricalde, a former student in our department, who's now a professor at Melbourne, and Lori Weingard, also at Carnegie Mellon. So we sort of asked, the first question was just, okay, how do these tasks get allocated? And the first thing that came to mind for me was promotion and tenure committees at Pitt. Okay, how do promotion and tenure committees work at Pitt? We all get together around a table in the dean's office, and the dean starts off by asking the dreaded question, who wants to chair the committee? It sounds like a great title. Everybody wants to be chair, but nobody wants to be chair of this committee, because all it means is that you get to walk out of there and write a report. You have no influence over anything. You just get to take 2 days out of your work week to offer the service that is critical to the university. So we wanted to look at that dynamics of how are we allocating these types of assignments. So to sort of first look just at the general phenomenon of just volunteering for tasks, we got some data from, we saw before that faculty members viewed serving on faculty senate as being a non-promotable task. So we were fortunate enough to get data from a very large public university, not Pittsburgh, where the way that they assign people to committees on faculty senate is that they send out an email to all the faculty and they say, can you please serve on the faculty senate? So everybody gets this request. If you're wondering whether or not this is a promotable task, you will be convinced otherwise when you see that a total of 3.7% of faculty who got this email wrote back and said, sure, I would like to be on the faculty senate. What is disturbing is that the numbers are quite different for men and women. So 2.6 of the male faculty wrote back and said, sure, I will do this. But there are many, many fewer female faculty, which meant that out of the female faculty, 7% of them wrote back to say, sure, I would like to be on faculty senate. Now you could say maybe the reason why they're doing this is that they don't think they actually will end up on faculty senate. So what we did was that we went in and said, well, we know that the women are underrepresented, but if they are reflective of the representation on faculty, so if I look at like assistant professors, they account for 38% of the faculty at this university, or the women's share of assistant professors is 38%, but their share of assistant professors and faculty senate is 60%. That's a huge burden compared to what the men is carrying, right? So we're seeing these, they're volunteering and they're ending up at the place. But now, problem with looking at this data is it could just be that women really care about faculty senate. Maybe that's what they enjoy to do in the evenings after having worked on research all day. They're like, faculty senate is where my preferred place is. So we decided to take this into our laboratory at Pitt. Have a fantastic laboratory to run experiments. It's one of the best laboratories in the world, and I am not exaggerating. It is why I'm here. It's why we have so many wonderful experimental economists in our department and around it. So we decided to try to design something that mirrored this. And what we set up as the incentives was that we said, okay, you're going to come in to our laboratory, you're going to make a decision in 10 different rounds. In each round, you're going to be paired with 2 other people. You don't know who they are. They're different people in the room. And you as a group will have 2 minutes to decide whether or not you want to click a button. If nobody clicks the button, all 3 members in your group will get $1. If you click the button, you get $1.25. You're going to be better off. Right? So it's like being at the dean's office. The dean is going to get really, really mad if nobody says, I'll do it. So if nobody's going to do it, you're better off saying that you will take one for the team. But the people who don't say that they'll take one for the team will get $2 when you volunteer. Okay, so the payoffs, just to summarize, are the following. If nobody volunteers, everybody gets $1. If you volunteer, you get $1.25. The 2 other people get $2, but you would just much, much rather have somebody else raise their hand and say, sure, I will take one for the team. So this is the very simple game that we play. They come into the lab, they're randomly paired with other people in the room. They're about 50% male, 50% female. And they get the following exciting screen in front of them. If they want to volunteer, they click the red button, and they should do it before the 2 minutes are up, or all of them are gonna get $1. Okay. Why is it 2 minutes? Because that's about as long as you can make it long for an undergraduate at Pitt. Okay, so let's see what happens. So they play this game for 10 rounds. And if we sort of say, do they figure out that it's a good idea to click the button? Yeah, they do. 80% of participants, like 80% of the groups end up getting somebody to volunteer. But is there a gender difference? And it turns out that there is. So women click about 1/3 of the time. They're in a group of 3 people. If we're going to have this work out with 100% success rate, that's about the rate that we should be seeing. We see they don't reach 100% success rate. So why are they not reaching that? It's because the men across the 10 rounds from the very beginning until the very end are less likely to click the button than the women are. Okay, if we look at sort of the overall distribution of how often are they clicking, so this is over the 10 rounds that they're playing. It's not hard to see that the distribution for women first order stochastically dominates that of men. Okay, so women are just far more likely. There are women who click 6 times, 7 times, 8 times, 9 times. And there's a huge group of men who are clicking never or once. Okay, so about 50% of the men don't click more than 1 time. Okay, so if I sort of say, well, what is fair? Fair is potentially arguing that we should be clicking 3 or more times. You can see a very large gender difference. Now, the question, of course, is why is this happening? Is it just men and women are different? Women are more altruistic. Maybe it's just that women care more about the group outcome, and that's why they're clicking. So we want to figure that out. The benefit of being in the lab is that we have an easy way of figuring that out. So imagine if the women are just more altruistically inclined. Now, if I take the women all by themselves, they should be volunteering more overall, right? So if women are just more concerned about the collective, I should be able to take the women into a group by themselves and see them volunteer more than if I took the men into a group by themselves, if they're less altruistic. So that's one way that I can see, is it just preferences between men and women that's driving this. Another option is that it isn't preferences, but rather that we're playing this coordination game. And the way you play a coordination game is that you very, very often try to see if there's something that's focal to that coordination game. And if we're used to women stepping up in these situations, and we come in and we play this game, if there's an expectation that the women are going to click the button, then it becomes in their interest to click the button, right? So suddenly, if it's just the expectation that women are clicking, that becomes the equilibrium of the game. So what we're going to do to try to figure that out is to say, let's run the same experiment, but now instead of having recruited both men and women to the lab, we're going to see what happens if I only have men show up. So only men are going to show up. If men are less altruistic, I should see them volunteer less in aggregate than if only women show up. But if it's a question of beliefs, that I come in, the men look around, and they say, the women aren't here, then they have to step up in order to get the success rate that they had before. So let's see what happens when we have these single gender sessions to see what the volunteer rate is, or sort of stepping up rates. So this is what we got in the mixed gender rate. If I have nothing but women, are we going to see them sort of get up to 100% success rate? Is that what's going to happen? That's not what happens. They volunteer at the exact same rate as we did in the mixed gender setting. What about the men? If they're less altruistic, or if they're more risk seeking, we should see them volunteer less. But what we're seeing instead is the exact same volunteer rate. So once I have a single gender session, there's no difference in volunteering. So that points to this coming from beliefs rather than it coming from the underlying preferences, differences in preferences between men and women. Now, another way I can check beliefs is to sort of say, well, what if I had a manager in the group? So a manager comes in, the manager cannot click the button by him or herself, but can ask somebody else in the group and say, can you please click the button? But the manager benefits from getting the person to say, sure, I'll click the button. So now the manager comes in, looks at the people in his group or her group, and decides who is going to be asked to do this, but with no commitment to do it. So basically, before we play the game, still the same coordination game, they have 2 minutes to do this. The manager sends a message saying, can you please click? Then they play the 2-minute round again, with the opportunity that other people could still step up. So basically, the expansion of the game is just that now I have a 4-person game with one manager who, if there's somebody in the group that clicks, the manager gets $2. If nobody clicks, the manager gets 1. But the manager, him or herself, cannot click, okay? So what does the screen look like? Now we actually have pictures of the people. So now they get to see exactly who's in the group. Of course, as you can imagine, there's lots of heterogeneity in what people look like that would cause you to not want to ask them or ask them. But if I sort of look at my representative group of 2 men and 1 woman, I can say, well, of those groups, how often is the woman asked? And what we see is when there's just 1 woman in a group. So just to reiterate what I said before, basically the person who's asked gets a message. We call the manager the red player, is unable to click himself. Red player asks you to invest, and the 2 other people get a message saying, this is the person who was asked to invest. So when we have the two women and one, or two men and one woman, what do we see? We see that women are asked 40% of the time. So she is more likely to be asked than the two men. Now we could say, well, of course she's more likely to be asked. I'm looking at, of course, the location of the, it's not like we put the woman in the middle, right? We're randomizing the order of the men and the women. But if it's just because the woman isn't a man, we should be able to just replace one of the men with a woman, and we should see the reverse, right? So if it's just a question of women, not the woman being the one who sticks out, we should be able to just say, well, what happens if I have two women? Am I now going to see the one man being asked 40% of the time and the two women being asked 30% of the time? And what we see when we get the two women, of course, not these two women, but all the groups with two women and one man, is that women are still asked 40% of the time. The men are asked even less. Okay, so it is not because the woman was different, it's because she was a woman. That's why she was asked more. If we sort of go through and we say, well, how does this sort of carry out to the overall distribution? As I said, there's lots of heterogeneity. There are men who are asked a lot, and there are women who are not asked a lot. But the distribution across all the people we have images of looks like this. Okay, so there are some women who are asked 4 times in total. There are some who get a total, this is by a strategy method, who get a total of 16 requests. Okay, and what you, of course, can see is that while there's lots of heterogeneity, again, the women are just asked a lot more. Now you can wonder if I'm claiming that this is, so this sort of reconfirms this thing that it's the expectation that women are going to say yes that causes us to ask them. Now, if it's the expectation, then I would expect the expectation to hold independent of the manager being female or male. So if I look at, if I have a male and female manager, how likely are they to ask the woman? And it turns out that it doesn't matter if it's a male manager or a female manager, they're equally likely to ask the woman. Now, of course, the relevant question is, if we're talking about this being beliefs, it should be confirming, right? So it's not just that I expect you to say yes, you also actually have to say yes in order for it to be an equilibrium. But can it possibly be a good idea to keep asking these women who are asked over and over? Aren't they going to be less likely to say yes eventually? Well, it turns out that it's a really good idea to ask a woman, because if you ask a woman, she says yes 75% of the time. If you ask a man, he says yes 50% of the time. So everything in what we're seeing is consistent with this story that we hold these expectations that women more than men will say yes. And as a result, they're more likely to be asked and they're more likely to step up when they're asked. So obviously that should sort of cause us to think about how we allocate these tasks. But we should also think about what the consequences are of this. So we talked about advancement differing between men and women. Like we have a new study that was done at Pitt where we sort of try to think more broadly about the consequences. In particular, what we're looking at in that study is sort of the, sorry, I don't know, I have that. So I said that. So what we want to look at in the next study is how does this affect the compensation that people are getting and how does it affect their ability to negotiate? So we know from lots of studies that women get paid less, they're less likely to enter negotiations, and negotiation is often seen as one of the leading reasons why it is that we end up with different compensation. So we want to look at that interaction and to see, try to identify, could that be coming from them holding different tasks? So what we do in the next study, this is joint with Rania Gillap at Pitt. I swear to giving a talk underneath these masks is lovely. What we're gonna, this is with Rania Gillap at Pitt and one of our former students, Rachel Landsman. And what we're gonna say is just suppose that we started from scratch. So it's not that I have like assigned a task because I think you're good or bad at something. I'm just going to randomly assign the task to participants, and I'm going to look at how it affects the compensation that you get and your ability to negotiate. So what we do in the lab to sort of mirror the high and low promotability task is that I'm going to assign my people in the lab one of two tasks. One is a slider task, which has the lovely, you have to move the cursor to the position of 50 on all of these. It is tedious and painful. The other task is a key press task. Most people would think that it's tedious and painful as well, but it's really, really fast. So you just have to, on your keyboard, type the letter that is read, and every time you get a pair, you get a point. So we have the workers in our lab. Of course, your students, they come in. One person is assigned to do the less productive task. The other one is assigned to do the more productive task. One is about 3 times more productive than the other. Of course, the students don't know that. So there's uncertainty over exactly how much more productive one task is. So it's the reason why you're solving lots of problems here, because you're just really, really dedicated to your job? Or is it because it's just a much easier job to do? So if we go back to thinking about how we assign promotable and less promotable work, imagine if you're a book salesperson working for an academic publisher, you can get the cushy job of selling books in Cambridge, or you can get the less cushy job of selling books in Ames, Iowa. Okay? Even if you're a really, really good salesperson in Ames, Iowa, it's going to be hard to compete with the person who got the more productive task of being in Cambridge. So that's the thought. And if you know that these two tasks were assigned randomly, how is it going to influence how much you pay them? So the way we run the experiment is that we say we have one manager. So we have 3 people in a group. They are together for 5 rounds. One person, the green worker, gets the slider task, the less productive task. The other worker, the blue worker, gets the really productive task. They're both going to work away at this task in 5 different work periods. And once they have solved these problems, solving those problems generates a revenue that goes to the manager. The more they produce, the more the manager gets. But he also gets a fixed pie that depends on how much they produce that he gets to distribute to the 2 workers. Okay. So the question is, how much is he going to distribute to one worker versus the other when he knows that the tasks were randomly assigned? And how able are they to affect how much they get through negotiation? So just to be clear, the key part here is that every time they solve a slider or every time they solve a set of key presses, they generate 5 cents for the group. They solve lots of these. That gets distributed between the workers. And at the same time, the manager gets 2.5 cents for every task that they've solved. So the manager wants these people to produce as much as they possibly can. He benefits by coming up with a compensation scheme that helps them keep working, okay? So we're gonna run 2 treatments, one where there's no negotiations, just to see if the manager just gets to decide how to compensate them. How is he gonna do that? And then one where there's a possibility of entering a negotiation. The screen that the manager gets sort of looks like this. In this case, the green worker solved 22 sliders. The blue worker solved 82 letter pairs. And the manager gets to decide how much of the total surplus is going to go to the 2 workers. Are you going to equalize the pay? Are you going to give more to the blue worker who's more productive? While knowing that you want to keep the guy in Cambridge working really hard because he's bringing in lots of revenue. Okay, so how does this affect the compensation? As I said before, we have these people working away. They're doing it for 5 rounds, stuck at the task with no opportunity to move elsewhere. And what happens to, so as I said, oh my gosh, this goes very quick. So as I said, the performance on this key press is just much, much faster. So there's no overlap between the 2 performance distributions. once the manager decides how much to pay them, he compensates for the fact that one is more productive than the other, but not by that much. So you can still see that the typing worker, the person who ended up in Cambridge, is making more money, but not by as much as they're bringing to the table. So you end up getting about a 25% wage gap between the person who got the more productive task over the less productive task. So just by the random assignment of task, one worker is making more money. Now, we could ask, well, what happens if they can negotiate? So now if I let them go in and say, I'm not happy with how much money I'm making, so now we're going to make it possible for the worker before the manager sets the wage to knock on the door and say, can I talk to you? Because I got stuck in Ames and there's nothing I can do. Is that going to somehow help the person in Ames? And likewise for the person in Cambridge, what's going to happen when the person in Cambridge goes and knocks on the door to say, I'm making lots of money in Cambridge, but it's because I'm really, really good at selling books. Okay, so if we allow for that initial negotiation, of course, it's up to the workers whether or not they want to negotiate. We still see the same pattern in terms of performance. We see a larger wage gap. It increases by about 6%. Once I sort of look at the overall differences, you can see how much bigger it is. So let's just sort of look at simple regression. So this is my typing worker and my slider worker on the right. You can see that if I solve a letter pair, of course, it helps out the person who performed it, the typing worker, but the slider worker also gets benefit from it. Same with the slider worker. It benefits both workers, but of course benefits the worker who performed the task the most. What's intriguing is that once I allow for negotiation, the benefit, the advantage that we had for the slider worker or disadvantage for the slider worker gets even bigger. So there is much more money going to the typing worker when I allow for negotiation. And why is that? It's because when typing workers go in to negotiate, so if the person in Cambridge goes in to negotiate, it is a very successful negotiation. So if you are assigned a highly productive task and you go in to negotiate, you get more money. But if you're assigned the less productive task and you go in to say the reason why you're not producing very much, it has no effect on your compensation whatsoever. So what is driving this is that you can't negotiate unless you have the productive task. So if we're looking at men and women getting different tasks, it may be that they're not negotiating because they're not in a position where they can improve their pay when they negotiate. The people who can improve their pay are the ones who have been given the highly productive task. So you can see it's really just, it's not that they get punished for negotiating. It's just that whenever the more productive worker goes in to negotiate, they take the surplus away from the slider worker. Of course, we can say, well, why is it that the more productive worker, not the more productive by inheritability, but just because we randomly assigned them to the more productive task? Why are they more successful in negotiating? Well, as you can imagine, they're saying different things, right? So indeed, when we ask them, what do you think is fair? The key press worker think that the fair thing to do is that they get more than half of the pie. That's not the case for the slider worker. Similarly, they have very self-serving views of how difficult one task is. So the slider worker thinks that the key press worker is much, much easier than it actually is, and vice versa. Okay, so they come into a negotiation, they have different perceptions. So what we decided to do was just to say, well, let's look at what they're saying in these negotiations. So we had a bunch of undergraduates code what they said, and sort of told them specifically to categorize what was being said in the chats, whether or not it was humor, did they talk about the merit of the task. My favorite statement is the first. It says, sir, I need this. This is from a green worker who's stuck on the slider task. It says, sir, I need this. My family needs this. I'm about to send my kids out of spreadsheet ghost for the 5th straight Halloween. My wife is on the verge of leaving me. Through all of this, I still come in, put my head down and get my work done. Am I a blue worker? No, but I think I'm one of the best green workers we have here. So they clearly are getting into this, right? So the question is whether or not these different chat messages work. Another one is a direct threat. We see that as well, where the blue worker says the green worker isn't pulling in the kind of money I am. I want 75%. That corresponds to what the worker is producing relative to what the green workers. It will make the green worker work harder anyway, better for all of us. The manager says the green worker's task is more time consuming, therefore harder. So do you want my income? If he can't make as much money, that's not our problem. And so on and so forth. So there's a direct threat coming in. So we try to look at how these chats line up. Of course, they line up exactly as you would expect with, if you are a typing worker, you talk about the fantastic output you have. If you are a slider worker, you're more likely to say how hard your task is compared to the key press worker. Another place where we see a difference is whether or not you're aggressive. You don't have much to be aggressive with if you're on the less productive tasks. So the people who are aggressive are, of course, the key press workers. And whether or not you talk about it regarding is the other difference. But basically, when we include all these differences, we do find that if you are a very productive worker, threatening statements and aggressive statements are quite productive. It's still the case that just being in the negotiation, even if you don't, just going into a negotiation independent of what you say is really what is driving up the difference. By contrast, if you are the slider worker, you can say whatever you want. It has no effect on your compensation. So what we're finding in this study is sort of that the task that you're assigned really affects the compensation that you get and your ability to improve that compensation. So the less productive, the person assigned to the less productive work task gets less pay and can't improve their salary through negotiation. And it's sort of, it's really coming from this task allocation that's driving these differences in compensation. So if we sort of, to wrap up, if we say, well, what are the policy implications of this? Well, it's clear that if we have these underlying structural differences in the work that we assign to men and women, then having policies that just try to fix the wage gap are not going to be very successful as long as we have this structural underlying difference. Okay? So, for example, one of the highly advocated recommendations is for women to just lean in and negotiate. Okay? So Sheryl Sandberg has a whole book and websites and groups about leaning in. If the reason why women are not negotiating is that they can't negotiate, then it doesn't help for us to tell them to go in and negotiate. In fact, I have another paper with Christine Exley at Harvard and Muriel Needley at Stanford, where we look at what happens if we just have men and women deciding whether or not they want to negotiate, and we suddenly decide to force them to negotiate. It turns out that that makes women much worse off. So the reason why women are not negotiating in that study is because they're not going into negotiations that will make them worse off. So this notion that we can't just look at differences in outcomes without fixing the structural problems that are underlying them. So what we sort of have written up in this book that Colin mentioned is talking about how is it that we can possibly equalize the assignments that we have for men and women. So both talking about these studies, but also lots of conversations we've had with men and women and organizations about these issues. And, first lesson is that the solution is not to get women to say no. Why is that not the solution, to say no? Because if we're all expecting them to say yes and they start saying no, the backlash against that could be very substantial. more importantly, we're not looking for organizations where all the important work that needs to get done doesn't get done. So the solution is not to get a bunch of naysayers, it's to get a bunch of yay-sayers. So ways to sort of get that and help equalize the assignments at the same time, I think is largely coming through just awareness. I think there are a few organizations, certainly a few of the organizations we've spoken to, who are aware that when they ask somebody to volunteer for a task, that they're more likely to end up assigning the task to a woman. The organization that Linda worked with had no idea that they were assigning non-promotable work to women. Once they realized that they were assigning non-promotable work to women, they changed the practice. So how do you change the practice if you're used to randomly assign work or used to asking for volunteers or going to ask the woman because she's happy to always take on the task? One of the ways to do it is to, instead of, and luckily we've now changed the process at Pitt, rather than asking for somebody to chair the promotion and tenure committee, just draw names out of a hat. Like, nobody wants to do this task. There's no reason to ask. You know, I'm always amazed that every single promotion and tenure committee, people say that they're busy. Of course you're busy. You know, and yet somehow when you made that statement, it was like, oh, if you're busy, then you can't do it. Right? So just put names into a hat, take turns, right? It does not take a lot of technology to improve this. I think in terms of mentoring, that can go a long way as well. I've done a number of interviews with young men and women who have just entered the labor force. So what we see from business schools is that men and women pretty much leave in business schools in equal shares. They enter corporations at pretty much 50-50. And very quickly after they get there, we see large differences between men and women. When you go and talk to the women, I spoke to one woman in mergers and acquisitions. And she was very happy because she had been assigned the task of recruiting interns for the group. And she felt like recruiting interns for the group was a really good job because it got her to know all the different groups within the organization. But she was in mergers and acquisitions. So she had no idea that she was not doing the promotable work. She had been asked to take on this task. She was performing it the best she possibly could. But nobody bothered to tell her that that's not what matters if you want to get promoted in mergers and acquisitions. So mentoring and talking about what is the work that's going to get you promoted is critical. It is also really critical if women are more eager to please or more worried about the consequences of not saying yes, to have them recognize what is the implicit no that happens every time you say yes. What is it that you are not able to do if you take on this additional task? So, you know, I think in some organizations, we've also seen quite some success in reassessing what is promotable. There are lots of tasks that are critical, such as recruiting interns, really critical to the success of an organization. It is odd that such a task is not seen as promotable, given how critical it is for the success of the organization. So this is what we talk about in the book. A lot of it sounds hard, but we've seen at Pitt as a stellar example that it's possible. This is promotion and tenure committee. It just takes a knitted hat with some names in it, and you can actually randomly assign the task instead of asking for volunteers. In terms of sort of awareness, I think we just need to open up our eyes a little bit and things will get better quickly. I don't think this assignment of women to non-promotable work is something that we've done intentionally. It's just the way that we started playing this game. I'm hopeful that eventually when we see a picture like this, we will recognize that there's something wrong. This is Kirsten Nielsen, the former Homeland Security Secretary. Not that I want us to feel particularly bad for her, but she's leaving a meeting on the beautiful border wall. It is a meeting run by her. She is the lead person at this meeting. And she's walking out of there carrying the coffee. Okay. We should get to the point where when we see that, we notice it. And when we see it's not like the New York Times that published this picture noticed it either. So I think awareness can get us a long way on this. So just to finish up, these are my co-authors on this new book. The whole process of thinking about non-promotable work started more than 10 years ago when we formed a club that was about saying no because we were all overcommitted on doing non-promotable work. And after all these years, we've finally written this book that's going to come out in May that talks both about the club and about all the work that we've done, research around it. So that's it. Thank you so much. I hope you have some questions.
Actually, we take a short, do we take a break in these things normally or not? We normally take a short break, I think, do we? Or is that just the lunchtime talks?
Yeah, typically I think we just go straight to
We'll
questions.
go straight to questions. Before though, I want to announce something I forgot to announce at the beginning, that there is a sheet where we're doing taking names for contact tracing purposes. So if you do leave before the end of the Q&A, then please sign your name. If you're well known to us, just the name is fine. But if you're not so well known to us, put your email address in there too. So thanks very much. That was great. I usually run a queue. I saw Sandy first, so good.
I was curious because many decades ago, there was a study, there was an analysis done on women scientists and about the kinds of norms of expectation about being a woman and being a scientist really being antithetical. And I'm wondering whether, so the expectation is that to be a good and friendly woman, you should carry the coffee, right? Because that's a kind of female task, nurturing and feeding and all of that kind of stuff. But to be a successful business person, you shouldn't be the person carrying the coffee. And so there's this kind of gender clash between meeting the norms of the gender norms in a structure, an institution, or embedded in society, and meeting the norms of success for being an actor in that institution. And I'm wondering if those kinds of expectation clashes are something you all have been thinking about.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a very valid point, and it's part of the reason why we're saying that the solution is not for women to say no, because the expectations are so strong. So that is precisely why this is not a problem that women can solve, but one that organizations have to solve, because they can't say no.
Right.
I think they, part of what we talk about in the book is how you can wiggle out of things. How when somebody asks you, I remember one of the questions I've gotten in my department was to be on the website committee because I was seen as somebody who had a sense of colors. I asked if I could be on recruiting instead, right? So you can change a request that is unreasonable into a negotiation without seeming offensive. You can also delay request, or you can point out how many other things you're doing without it seeming offensive. So that's part of what we talk about in the book as well. But you're absolutely right. The norms are very different. And the challenges are that once you become a yay-sayer, deviating from that will get a very harsh response. So it's not a problem that women can just solve on their own. And it is not one that should be in their interest to solve on their own. This is really something that, it's fine if we realize that women are not good at doing the promotable work, then they shouldn't be doing the promotable work. But right now, we're from the very beginning when they enter the labor force, segueing them off on a different track. So we never get to see if they actually were the better candidate for promotion and taking on the promotable work. So, but thank you.
I have a question about the policy. So, I mean, one way it really appeals to me, yeah, I do see like now asking more here. But then I have this worry, and I wonder if you thought about that. Sometimes you have people who essentially are not, for example, are not stuff like that. And then there's this tendency to not assign the work to them because the work is just not going to be done and it's going to be a nightmare for everyone. And I do also wonder if there's something gendered about this tendency.
So that's a very good point. So I should also add that random assignment is not the solution always. The random assignment is a solution when you otherwise would have asked for volunteer, right? So if you're willing to ask for volunteer, it means that the skills on the task can't be that critical, so you're willing to take anyone from a set. So once you have agreed that you will take a volunteer, you should be willing to randomly assign. So there are many cases where you have someone in your workforce that has very unique skills, and it would be foolish to put them on a less promotable work. So once you've identified the skills, there are people who should not be doing a lot of non-promotable work. Question is just how do we get to the point where we've identified skills? Now, in terms of, I think very often strategically shirking a non-promotable work, I'm sure that doesn't happen in your department, but we've certainly seen sign of it in our department. It's true, you don't want to put somebody who shirks on a promotion and tenure committee. It's like the most important thing that we do is to get good faculty. If you put somebody who shirks on that, it could ruin everything. What we're arguing is that we should look at all the non-promotable work. If you are, despite the fact that you can write great papers, give great talks, if you be a good teacher, but somehow can't manage to write a committee report, then there's a very easy way to fix it. If you are not able to do that, you can teach more so that the people who can't do the task can teach less. So we need to be trading off. If you are incapable of doing some non-promotable work, then let's have you do some other non-promotable work. It can't be that you just strategically show lack of skill and then you get out of it, right? So if you time and again show that you can't do it, then you just get another course. We know that that is less promotable. I really think we need to think about how many hours are you spending on non-promotable work. Harvard, in response to our work, or the Kennedy School, introduced a program where you get points for the non-promotable work that you do. And of course, it's not non-promotable. This is, when I say non-promotable, it is critical work to our institutions. So it has to be done, but we're not counting it. And what they're doing now is that you're getting points for the work and the service work that you're doing. And everybody has to get above a certain level so that there's some accounting of it. What would be really nice is also if they had a cap on how many points you can get, because junior women have subsequently been found to have way too many points. But at least by bringing everybody up to a minimum requirement, it helps somewhat.
Just circling back to the logic at the beginning of the talk, I thought there was a compelling empirical case for how this differential volunteer works. And also there's a very clear theoretical case as to why differential non-promotional tasks could lead to differential representation like that. I'm wondering what we know empirically about the relation between the factor you're identifying and the numbers you started with.
So you mean in terms of like the advancement of women in organizations?
Yeah, I suppose I was interested. I can see this is incredibly difficult to answer empirically, but how much do we know about how much of the gender gap might be explainable by factors like this?
We don't know. We don't know. And the challenge is that these effects are gonna accumulate. Right? So we know that not asking for a salary raise at the beginning of your job could result in millions of dollars later on, right? Because everything accumulates on one another. So I don't know how we would be able to figure it out. I do think that by tracking work assignments early on and looking like 5 years after you've started and trying to look at differences there and trying to extrapolate what that might mean later on is one way of doing it, but it's not work that we've done. I think it's work that's really critical because the advantage here compared to all the other things that we've done, I've done work in negotiation and all these, the gender differences in competition. I don't really know what the solution is to men being more competitive and more overconfident. It's not like we want to train women to be more competitive and overconfident. It's not even clear that those are skills that we want from a manager, right? So that's just a really hard problem to solve. This is not that hard a problem to solve because we're talking about the non-promotable tasks are more often than not tasks that anyone can do. So who you assign to the task is not that critical for many of the tasks. You know, why not you a note taker at a meeting? Why not you chair the committee after promotion and tenure? It does not matter that much. So that means that we have a lot more room to move things around.
So I was interested in how you claim that one of the, or kind of the major institutional change that should take place is one having to do with awareness. Because a lot of the, at least in sort of popular discourse around issues of social inequality, awareness is often spoken of in terms of individualistic psychology, you know, educating yourself and learning to monitor your biases and things like this. So I'm just wondering if you could say more about what institutional awareness would look like, or what sort of measures or steps.
So
involved there.
it's not that awareness is, absent awareness, you're not going to get any structural changes in organizations, right? So understanding that this is a problem and documenting it in organizations, we can see in the organizations that we have worked with, they were not aware of these differences. And you know, we've seen some organizations where it became clear that women were doing all the non-promotable work, that the women just went on strike. There's a very famous case coming from Pitt itself, where a committee was called and all the representatives that showed up from the sciences, which we all know are heavily male, all the representatives that showed up for the sciences to the committee at the dean's office were female. And the problem is, once you're aware, you look at one another and say, why are we all female? Right? So it's not to say that I don't think that we've been paying attention to non-promotable work. And once we recognize it as such and recognize that women are more likely to be assigned to it, it is going to be harder to be in a faculty meeting and ask for a volunteer and see a woman volunteer without people cringing. And I think that cringe is going to get people to think about institutional changes. But part of what we talk about in the book is, how do you get sort of grassroots movements going in organizations? What are the things that you need to be doing to not only get awareness, but get action as well? And how do you get, from the organizational level, how do you get to implement some of these things? But the start of all of this is awareness that there's a problem, documentation that there's a problem, because if you don't have that, none of this is going to be sustainable. So when I say awareness, it's just, if you don't have that, nothing else that you're going to do, if you have not documented that women are doing more non-promotable work, no one is going to be happy with the institutional changes that you make to try to fix it. So I don't know if that answered your question, but we're not talking about awareness as a standalone, but rather than a necessary condition for everything else to happen.
So I run a queue here. You'll be after the next question, okay?
Thank you. I wanted to mention a different hypothesis, which might not be incompatible with yours, but so the idea is that maybe women feel that they need to do more work to achieve the same success as their male colleagues. So, for example, they might perceive that while a male colleague can be successful just in applications, women have the same amount of success, but also have to sit in committees, do more teaching. I'm just wondering if you've got thoughts about that, or if you're experimental.
Well, it does not, it sort of goes back to Sandy's question, right? If I'm up against these expectations, right? So in our experiment, there's no judgment of you not doing something. It's a pure coordination game. Now, if you imagine if we're playing a coordination game in the real world, it's not just that I know that I have to step up because otherwise nobody else will. It's also that I know everybody has this expectation of me. So if I don't step up, it's not just that it won't get done, but there's going to be negative repercussions for me, right? So it sort of goes to it goes back to the expectations story, the fact that we have these gendered norms that, you know, may have roots going really far back, but the benefit of it coming from expectations is that expectations are something that is not saying that they're super easy to move, but once you have collective backing to not give into the expectation, it becomes easier to not give into it. Right? So I fully agree that part of the reason, that's part of what we're showing. The reason why women are stepping up is not because they enjoy being on faculty senate. It's not that they like to. I've always wanted to get the data from the dean's office and who's writing the reports. It's not because they enjoy it, because if the men are not there, they do it less. So I think what is nice in terms of policy is that if it is driven by expectations, there are things like awareness that can help move those expectations.
This is fascinating, by the way. Really kind of what I'm wondering about is how can we account for people either consciously or unconsciously doing poorly in the past to avoid future doing it. So you gave the example of, well, okay, if you're bad at being the committee chair, she's poor. Well, what if, how can you trust somebody that isn't intentionally, avoiding the committee work so they can teach more? And part of that is also how do you think, part of what makes me think of this is a friend of mine's mom talked about when she first started out 40 years ago in business management. She purposely never learned to type, but nobody ever asked her to take notes. So how can we, get people to learn the skills necessary to do some of the non-promotable work when they don't want to do it?
Well, so in most corporations, we have a bit more leeway than we do at universities, right? So if you can't do the work you're being asked to do, there are significant consequences to that, right? So not knowing how to type, if everybody needs to be typing, then they can find somebody who does know how to type, right? So it's not, I don't want to trivialize the problem, but there are, rather than, I can, in our department, there are people who are good at doing service work, and then there's a lot of people who somehow can do everything else except for service work. And there's no doubt that the people who are good at doing service work are doing at least twice as much than the ones who somehow have this disability when it comes to service work. And it is not an easy thing to fix, but counting the hours that we're doing and finding other ways. I think a lot of service work is easier to do than taking on another class. And if there's a threat of taking another class on, once you have been shirking on service work, I think the shirkers can figure out how to write the report. It's just right now, there are no consequences. Why would you not pretend like you were a shirker? So, but it is not a straightforward solution. It's just trading off the non-promotable work against the non-promotable work. Are ways to do it. One of the big challenges is that there are, if you look at universities, we have fewer women than we have men, but there are lots of committees where we want women. We've spoken to lots of organizations where they very proudly tell us that they have 50% representation of women on every committee. Now, you can't have 50% representation on every committee if you only have a third of the faculty being female without overburdening the women. Right? So thinking about, well, if it is that critical to have women on all committees, and is it really critical to have them on all committees, like food purchasing, holiday parties, maybe representation is not that critical in everything. So thinking more carefully about what it means to ask for 50% representation can help you sort of allocate the scarce resources to where you want it. And if it really is where it gets much, much worse, is if we look at faculty of color. I mean, we have this weird notion that we hire a few people of color and then we put them on every single picture at every committee so we can pretend like we have more. Like, how are they ever going to succeed if we keep tasking it? It's like this cultural taxation that somehow they will just figure out, it must be that they have more hours in the work or something, but it's not to say that their representation is not important. But if it is important on a bunch of committees, then take them out of other non-promotable work, give them a lower teaching load. To really think about the trade-offs, what are the things that get you promoted? If it is research, then you can't tax the people that you want to represent with more service work. So like really thinking on the margin of how you get people in the service tasks that you want them in and not overburdening them.
So I'm going to inject myself and then I'll come back around to the other hands I just saw. But your last response, part of that response anticipated one of the questions I want to ask, which is, if you're really just randomly selecting from within a committee that's already disproportionately overrepresenting a minority, aren't you just then pushing that burden disproportionately onto that minority? So not only are they on the committee disproportionately, but they're also then going to end up with the same probability as anybody else on the committee, but there's more of them. So we're going to end up with disproportionate additional burden.
Yeah, so I mean,
Right.
at least by doing the random draws, you're going to do less than what you would have done if you were volunteering, right? Another thing that, very clever insight from the dean's office is that if you've recently written a committee report, your name does not go in the hat, right? So
That limits the number of points you can score.
as we start thinking about this, there's simple things that may not be ideal,
Mhm.
but at least they're getting us closer to where it is that we want to be.
Yeah, good. So that suggests it's a very complex system and
Yeah.
you do one thing and it has ramifications other places. So I'm wondering to what extent you've actually been able to model even those different interactions rather than having a sort of bullet list of things we might think about. But that might be further work down the road. I've got another question, but I'm going to go to the audience. So, yeah.
So I wanted to circle back to your beginning, so where you were motivating your work based on the fact that women are underrepresented all across the world in corporate and past CEO positions. So I wanted to comment on how your work illuminates an answer to that question, and it resonated to me this notion of beliefs and how the beliefs and expectations are formed in society, and whether there is a way to change those with information about how productive women could actually be in positions that are of higher power.
So, and I mean, so thank you very much for doing that, because that is sort of that is what I think is the unifying issue, is that we have women, I don't know where beliefs are coming from, but we see women across lots of different societies picking up more of the non-promotable work at home. We've seen our mothers pick up more non-promotable work. We've seen our grandmothers pick up more of the non-promotable work, that when we get into these workplace settings, we carry on the expectations from all the other interactions that we've had. And it may not be possible to totally change those expectations, but at least if we set as organizational goals that we're going to track who's doing what, we're going to try to be able to keep it in check, right? So if we don't want an organization where women are doing 3 times more of the non-promotable work, then we just keep track of it. And right now we're not doing that. So, but you're absolutely, I do think that this tendency for us to put, if we're looking at a task that is less desirable, imagine if you're a manager, you need to get something done really quickly. Nobody wants to do it. Who are you going to ask? You're going to ask the person who objects, or you're going to ask the one who says, I'm happy to? You're going to ask the person who says, I'm happy to. And you're going to ask over and over and over. And before you know it, you've sent the female career in a completely different direction than where the male career was. Right? And that's, but it's disturbing in a lot of these conversations that we've had with women, is that they start out by just taking a little task, organize a conference. Then you're suddenly picked as being really good at organizing the conference. And before you know it, the skills that you had and the reason why you got hired become completely irrelevant, because you just become the conference organizer. So you get segued into these completely different career tracks. But it goes back to this fundamental issue. It does not matter. I've given talks many different places around the world. There's not a male or a female who doesn't recognize this pattern. There's not the number of men who come to me who talk about their female partners doing too much non-promotable work. This is I've yet to find a place where it's completely foreign to me. So I do think that this is a phenomenon that we see in lots of societies.
I have another question. So I'm thinking of different kinds of non-promotable work that we talked about. And things like that. So I'm thinking about like housekeeping kind of non-promotable work or something happen. So for example, in one of the departments I was at, there was a chair who was a woman, and in faculty meetings, they had a habit of drinking sherry.
I missed the,
Of drinking sherry.
oh, nice.
Yeah. But you see, someone who did the work. And okay, after the faculty meeting, she would come with the glasses. And there are, many others have like that, and so on like to them. And anecdotally or not, around me, I've noticed that they were involved more. Obviously, this is not promotable, but it's of a different kind. So it's maybe more difficult to track because no one is officially assigned, And also, I don't know how it influences the gender dynamics in the workplace. So I'm just kind of wondering generally if you thought about, those kinds of non-promotable tasks and.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is what is called office housework, which is, very well recognized that more women do more than men. I gave a talk at a university where before the talk started, an assistant female professor came in and set up the lunch for everybody who arrived. And then I showed the picture of Kirsten Nielsen and everybody laughed like, I was like, can we all agree on who set up lunch? So it's just, we don't see those tasks, but of course, if an assistant professor has to spend 30 minutes before every single seminar to set up a lunch, that's going to affect her research productivity. And it's true that it's harder to track, but an awareness of those tasks and how it affects people could cause us to say, is it really the best use of a faculty member's time that she's setting up lunch? Or would this be a task that should be given to a staff person instead, right? So by thinking about those low-hanging things that nobody wants to do to really reallocate it, maybe it could be a really good task for somebody at a different position. So I think the challenge in sort of focusing too much on the office housework is that we're forgetting the really important task that takes the vast majority of our time. So, if you think about, we talk about non-promotable and promotable, but it's really a sort of a continuum. And you want to not do the least promotable work of your colleagues. So I spoke to one woman who was very excited. She had also just started in a top consulting company, and she, on her own, had been assigned to work with this firm that used to be handled by a senior partner who was retiring. She was the only one working there. That's a non-promotable work. Nobody cares about what happens at this old firm that has been a client of this firm forever. But she's still doing the same kind of work. It's just not the exciting. So in order to figure out what is promotable in your organization, it's like, what is it that people are cheering for? What is the new client that comes in that gets everybody excited? What is it that gets written up? In this case, she was sidetracked from the minute she entered the organization, and 2 years later, she was still just working with this client. That's all she did. With nobody saying, should we try to see what happens if we put her with one of the new clients who comes in? What if we put her into IT? What would happen there? So it's just at a minimum, we bring people in, give them the same opportunity to demonstrate their skill. If their skill are best suited for being with the least revenue generating, fine. But you don't know that if you send them there to be.
So you just said kind of front of my question. So in the slider typist manager scenario, it's really clear what the objective is, right? There's this profit, and they're trying to divvy that up. But there's other institutions, like I was in the Air Force when I was younger, And when it comes to officers and promotions, you see in the Air Force that women officers tend to go into roles that are less promotable, and men will go into roles that are more promotable at higher rates, right? So men will become fighter pilots, and that has a fast track to the top, whereas women might go into acquisitions and logistics or things like that. But both of those things within this organization are very important to the objective of like winning awards, right? But it's not like a profit, like something that's very easy to see how you contribute in those types of settings. How do you assign people, like? What I'm saying?
Yeah, so, you know, the setting that we're looking at in terms of the spider task and the key press is, you know, as simple as it could possibly be.
Yeah.
It really is having a sales representative in one place and not in the other. There's no complementarity in the production. What you're talking about is strong complementarities, right? You can't be a fighter pilot unless you have people doing the acquisitions. Right? So once you have strong complementarities, it becomes really critical that you have the best skilled, the person with the comparative advantage assigned to the right task. Now, it's not to say that men and women should all be doing the same work. We have different preferences. It may be that the reason why the men are being fighter pilots, there are too many words in there for me, that they enjoy it more, that that's what they want to do. So it's not to say that we should identify the skills, account for the preferences when we do these task allocations. But I think what we're realizing is that we spoke with one firm where the women, all the pro bono work was handled by women in the organization. It's not because women just, without question, care more about pro bono work, but you don't get promoted off of that. So it's to at least start a discussion where we say the stuff that nobody wants to do, let's make sure that we allocate that in a way that accounts a little bit for skills and our ability to identify skills.
And my question was just coming from the fact that, as far as I'm concerned, you're the expert on these things, so I was just curious in the different settings.
And so, I mean, it's assigning the people to the right task is much more important when they're complementarities, right? Because then you get this amplifying effect.
I'm going to ask my second question, which gets back to the experiments. And it also picks up on something you said a lot during the talk and in the Q&A about awareness. So I'm wondering if you did one of these experiments and then showed the subjects the effects of their behavior in those experiments and then have them play again, would you think this is a worthwhile experiment? Would we learn anything generalizable from it? Do you think it would change the behavior of the subjects in the experiment?
It's hard to run an experiment like that because you don't know if there's going to be experimental demand effects coming at the same time. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky. I mean, it would be interesting to, you know, all experiments are interesting. You learn something every time. It would just be harder to identify where the effect is coming from. What we did do was that we had, you know, we've done so many experiments around this, but we had third parties look at what happened and ask them to tell us who they thought volunteered. And, you know, it won't be a surprise, they thought the women were the ones who were volunteering more than men, right? So it's sort of a very consistent story about the collective expectations we have of women having a greater likelihood of stepping up in these settings. And it may well be that we could find a way of, you know, just showing them another group's decision and seeing if that somehow gets them to move away. You know, I keep wondering, like, what would happen if we, you know, in our setting, you know, what is more challenging in a workplace setting is that, you know, we keep interacting over and over, right? Whereas in our experiment, you just have one interaction. But so I've sort of been inclined to say, well, what would happen if we put 3 people together for 10 rounds? You know, are they going to take turns? You know, is it the case that they're going to figure out the only way we're going to get all the surplus is if we take turns? But it still leaves the question, you know, we're 3 people in 10 rounds, who's the one who takes the 10?
Right.
So I do think if we have if we're collaborating and we realize that there is large potential penalties from somebody getting upset, that we will, to some extent, take turns if we're close. But yet, I still remember Marla Paul is the chair of our department, and I still remember we were in this department where I think for a long time it was just Marla and me as the female faculty members. And there was a promotion and tenure case where somebody had written a document that really needed help. And we were all sitting in this meeting. We're agreeing that somebody should take the weekend and help this faculty member rewrite the document. And we walk out of this meeting and Marla and I were carrying all the papers. And it's like, how did this just happen? It's like I'm doing all this research and here I am walking out with it. So it's just it's quite ingrained
Yes.
that we end up doing
Yeah.
this, right?
I mean, it wouldn't completely solve the experimental demand effect, but if you could bring people back the next day or a week later or a month later and see whether there's more lasting. Of course, they might still remember having been in debrief before, but maybe tweaking the game slightly would make them not exactly be thinking that they're in the same situation. Yeah, good. I got a couple more questions now. So David, first, yeah.
Just very quickly speaking about the shared commission, Oxford philosophy had a point system and you could spend the points on courses. I want to ask academic example again. I want to ask about refereeing. I mean, if you like, that's a quintessential task that's highly skilled, so can't be passed off to administrators, is important. Sorry, highly skilled, but highly academically skilled and can't be passed on to administrators. Is important, but is completely invisible. But is also largely invisible in terms of the kind of peer pressure effects as well. So not being other colleagues. Do we know anything about whether there's differential willingness to referee?
There's a recent study that just came out by Stefano Della Vigna at Berkeley, who was the referee at the American Economic Review. And I don't know, they looked at lots of different things on gender, and I don't remember if they looked at that. I think one of the challenges is that, I mean, we have promotion and tenure committees in our department where we're always, we should make sure that we get some women to write letters. But there are not very many women to ask. So they get asked all the time. So certainly when I've been talking to editors, they say, oh, no, it's not true. If I ask women, they say no more than the men say no. But I think it's because they're getting more requests, not necessarily just from your journal, but if I think about Susan Athey is like the theorist, the female theorist, I think she gets 10 requests per day to do something because so she has to say no, right? So in order to sort of assess, you sort of need a collective assessment from all the refereeing and all the letter writing to see what the frequency is. The only way to really assess it is to go at the individual level and ask them to sort of do it by diary studies and say, how much time are you spending in any given week on these tasks, and take it from there. I don't think you can sort of just go to one journal and look at it.
Okay, question for Rebecca.
I'm thinking of the sort of aware species. I think that'd be a differential. Being aware, you can also be like, oh, women are gonna say yes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, so that's a very well taken point. It actually goes back to your comment, Colin, where if we're just taking it into a setting, you could very well look at the data and what has happened in the past and actually have an even stronger expectation that the women are going to do it, right? So it's not clear what direction the expectation is going to go in. So it's true that awareness could make you just say, no, I definitely don't need to do it because the women are going to step up. The hope is that there is an empowerment in the people who tend to step up, all collectively knowing this is what we're doing. So that it's not just you saying no, it's a larger group of people saying no, right? It also means that if there's sort of volunteering and then there's voluntold, where, you're in a meeting and it's being suggested that you should do something again because you've done it so well in the past. If other people know that there is this tendency, it makes it easier to say, Marissa did it last time, maybe it's time for David to do it. Right, so it's true that some people may have even stronger expectations, but I do think having an organizational assessment of whether or not this is where you want to be is going to be empowering.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So, it's a follow-up in a sense, also to the colleague's point about changing behavior. So, sooner or later, whether or not the situation will change will depend on certain power structure.
It will depend on,
Power structure.
Yeah.
In corporations, states, like CEOs, politicians, and so on. So some of them will be, let's say, automatically willing to do something, and some others will not change their mind. Some people will expect some arguments, let's say, and there might be moral arguments that simply changing the situation will be morally good. We will end up with a more just society. Or there might be also more practical arguments that say, see, this corporation is more equal in this respect and it's doing better. So I wonder, is there any data showing what kind of arguments work better? The moral ones or the practical ones?
so I think we've had moral arguments for a long time. And they have not been very successful. Right? So we have had concerns about women's opportunities in the labor market for a long time. We've had a number of different initiatives. They have not moved anything. I think arguments that point to the profitability of changing things are going to get organizations more motivated. And if you don't have that motivation, it's not to say, I think every organization I really think wants to do the right thing. The nudge of also earning more money doing it, I think might help them going in the direction. I think there are few organizations that will not understand that if you bring in talented male and female workers, that it is not optimal for your organization to within the first 2 years have separate the women off on a non-promotable task. I don't think that that's where organizations are. And certainly the organizations we've spoken to, once they realize the problem that they have, they are very quick to change. They are very quick to track things. They are very quick to say, we're not going to do it this way anymore. I really, maybe I want to be optimistic. I don't think that we have been aware of how severe this problem of task allocation has been, or even that it has been a problem at all. So that's where, back to my awareness, which is why I'm talking to you. So that, and this is the main reason why we wrote a popular press book about it, is to hopefully get people to be aware that there are simple solutions that may not be the ultimate solution, but it's going to get us in the right direction. It's also to say, I think one important thing to keep in mind is we're talking about averages of women doing more promotable, non-promotable work. When we look at our all-male session, it turns out that the free riding men don't respond at all. The free riding men, the 50% of men who never volunteered or volunteered only one, do not respond to the composition of the group at all. The reason why the men are successful is that the men who volunteered a little bit sort of have to become super volunteers. So, there are men that we've spoken to who are in the organization where they're volunteering all the time. So it's not that there aren't men who volunteer. It's just if we could get to 50% who, independent of who they're with, never volunteering, to move up, it would just make it easier for everybody.
So there are two things we usually do at the end of these talks. One is have a reception, but we're not doing that today for a variety of reasons, including coronavirus restrictions. And the other is we thank our speakers by presenting them with this token of our appreciation for speaking at the center. And thanks for bringing awareness to the
For not being a reception. I think it's fantastic we can meet like this. But
Yeah, good. Thank you all. Now you're going to have to take the carrot.
No, this is great. This is fun. Thank you so much.
I was going to make a joke that the talk is higher quality than the umbrella, possibly. but-